Hello children, today we will take a trip to the past and learn about the democratic and nationalist revolutions that occurred in 17th and 18th centuries. At the beginning of the 17th century, England was ruled by kings and queens who wanted to keep the powers of the parliament restricted. In 1603, King James I of Stuart dynasty assumed throne and reduced the power of the representatives of the parliament. He was succeeded by Charles I, who went a step ahead, dissolved the parliament and ruled for about a decade without the parliament. This led to the unrest in the common population and they started to revolt. Let us begin with the glorious revolution of England. The English Revolution of 1688 was called the Glorious Revolution because it was not a war. No soldiers went into battle and no shots were fired, and yet the aim was achieved. A new king and queen simply replaced Charles I, who was getting increasingly unpopular. The parliament invited William and Mary to claim the throne. Charles' army deserted him and he fled to France. William and Mary were crowned in 1689. After the revolution, the people got a right to vote and parliament became supreme.
Today, America is the most powerful country in the world. But do you know how did it win its freedom? England had developed 13 colonies on the eastern coast of North America. The traders of England were favored. Thus, the American colonies protested and wanted to break away from the British rule. King George III declared a war in April 1775, and America finally won the war in October 1781 with the help of France.
The war between the British and American forces came to an end with the Treaty of Paris, by which Britain recognized the independence of the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence was adopted on 4th of July 1776. The third President of America, Thomas Jefferson, was the author of this declaration. A Bill of Rights was also adopted guaranteeing the freedom of speech, religion, and rule of law were enacted. This paved the way for the establishment of the United States of America. Now let us discuss French Revolution. We just told you how the American colonies got together, revolted against the injustice being done to them, and won their independence. This sent shockwaves throughout Europe and gave hope to the poor section of the society that wanted to see the powerful aristocracies of Europe fall. If America could do it, why couldn't they? Why couldn't they revolt and create a new, fairer society? Anything is possible if you have the will in you to do it.
During the 17th century, there was no equality among the citizens, and a huge gap existed between the rich and the poor. The church also extracted its share of taxes called tithes from the people. The poor in France were suffering greatly. They were mistreated, forced to work on the estates of the wealthy with very little pay. Because of all this, they were growing more resentful with each passing year. French society was divided into 3 separate castes known as estates. The first estate was made up of priests and religious leaders who occupied the highest level in French society. The second estate was made up of noble people, while the third and lowest estate comprised of everyone else, which included over 97% of the population of France.
In 1774, Louis XV ruled over France. To get the royal treasury filled, he forced the heavy taxes on common people and businessmen. The situation of the poor people worsened. There were so many philosophers and leaders during those times who tried their level best to come up with a workable plan to restore peace and order in the society. Philosophers like Locke and Rousseau visualized a new society based on freedom and equality for all. In his 2 treatises of government, Locke sought to refuse the absolute right of monarch. Rousseau also wanted to form a government based on social contract between people and their representatives. The ideas of these philosophers were extremely popular in the society. In the spirit of laws, Montesquieu proposed a division of the power within the government like USA, but no progress took place.
Louis XIV continued with his absurd policies, due to which France came under big debts. In order to pay off these debts, he decided that he would tax the first and second estates, which had always been exempt from paying taxes before, but the estates refused to pay the new taxes. So, in 1789, King Louis XVI summoned a group known as the Estates General to meet in Versailles to discuss the matter of taxes. The Estates General was a body of people representing each of the three social estates in France.
But King Louis XVI locked representatives of the third estate out of the meetings. They were obviously hurt and annoyed. They got together and they themselves gave the name of the National Assembly. The representatives took an oath that they would not leave until they had written a new constitution for France. King Louis XVI got worried and he did not want the constitution to be written entirely by the members of the third estate. So, he ordered representatives from the first and the second estates to join the National Assembly.
But the movement showed no signs of slowing down. King Louis XVI was further worried that the people may overthrow him. So he ordered the deployment of troops throughout the capital city as well as around the palace. A civil war broke out between the rebels and the soldiers, and the rebels were able to gain control of the prison and establish a new radical government in Paris.
Rumor broke out that lords or the noblemen were killing poor peasants. Frightened by this, the peasants started killing the noblemen and took possessions of their properties. This wave of violence is known as the Great Fear in the history.
Finally, the king had no choice but to give up and submit to the will of the much larger Third Estate. On August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly passed a number of important reforms that established feudal dues and levied taxes on members of the first and second estates. The National Assembly then drafted a Bill of Rights for the people. This Declaration of Rights included the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, and the freedom of religion, and also protected citizens from being falsely arrested.
But when the National Assembly presented their new reforms along with the Declaration of Rights to the king, he refused to acknowledge them. This greatly angered the people of France, who wanted to see a new era in freedom and equality. These people strongly demanded that the king not only accept these new laws, but also to move to Paris with his family. The resistance from these people was so strong that King Louis XVI was forced to move to Paris in 1780. Now the National Assembly started setting up a new government, including writing a constitution. By 1791, this constitution was ready. It kept the monarchy but limited its royal powers. It also established a legislature which would be elected by the people. This new constitution granted equal rights to all men who could vote only if they paid a tax. In order to pay off the national debts, lands owned by the church were confiscated and sold. Children, peace was still far from France.
In 1791, King Louis XVI, fearing for the lives of himself and his family, attempted to flee to Austria from Paris, but was captured and imprisoned on his way. In 1792, France declared war on Austria because the French feared that Austria would attempt to reinstate King Louis XVI on the throne. Prussia and Sardinia also joined Austria in this war. Though this war had devastating effects on France, it still somehow won the war. National Assembly, which was now known as National Convention, met in Paris and decided to completely do away with the monarchy and establish a republic. They also granted the right to vote to all men regardless of whether they could pay their taxes or not.
In 1792, King Louis XVI was tried before the National Convention, where he was found guilty of having conspired against the freedom of the nation. And in January 1793, he was put to death by the guillotine. You must be wondering what kind of a device it was. Well, it was a device to kill people in public by chopping off their heads. Thank God such devices are not used anywhere anymore. Now we shall study the after effects of this revolution. Monarchs throughout Europe were concerned about the events that had taken place in France. They thought that now people will overthrow them as well. They all got together and attacked France. This war made life very difficult in France. Various political parties in the parliament were of different opinions regarding the situation, and the young government was on the verge of falling apart.